Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Weaponizing Human Rights, Arrow in the Quiver of Empire. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'll serve as moderator today along with Nan McCurdy. We're looking forward to our featured speakers, Alfred Zayas and John Perry, and we'll introduce them in a few minutes. We want to thank Yoav Elenevsky and Erica Takeo, who are providing our technical support, and our many organizational co-sponsors who are being listed now in the chat. The webinars are hosted by the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, which has a new website at a new address, nicasolidarity.com. Before we begin, we have a few requests and announcements. You'll see several buttons available at the bottom of your screen. One button is for closed captions, CC. Just click it to turn it on. Also, feel free to use the chat function to offer comments throughout this event. But if you have a question for the speakers, please don't put your question in the chat or we may not see it. Instead, click the Q&A button and place your question there. We will select your questions from the Q&A to pose to our speakers. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants within the next few days. When it's ready, it will also be posted at the new website, nicasolidarity.com, and on the YouTube channel of Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. After today, our next Nicaragua webinar will be held in a month and a half on August 11th. It's titled Celebrating 45/19, Nicaragua's Revolution Lives On. Join us then to hear a report back from many participants celebrating the 45th anniversary of Nicaragua's July 19th triumph and ongoing revolution. You can register now for this webinar to post it on your calendar by going to bit.ly/Nica August 11th. That's the number 11. So again, bit.ly/Nica Aug 11, just AUG 11. This link will be posted in the chat. If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing foreign interference there, please join the International Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. You can check the website regularly at nicasolidarity.com. Also, please put your name and email address in the Q&A if you'd like to receive action alerts, the weekly newsletter, and monthly meeting notices. The coalition meets on the second Monday of each month at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The next meeting is on July 8th. We'll also enter some more information in the chat about other ways you can get involved or learn more about Nicaragua through a petition, the NicaNet email list, the weekly Nica notes, and several ebooks about Nicaragua. For those of you near New York City, please consider attending a demonstration tomorrow, June 24th, in front of the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, that's at 4 p.m., to deliver a petition signed by hundreds of organizations and individuals demanding respect for Venezuela's sovereignty and the international protection of President Nicolás Maduro under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes against Internationally Protected Persons. We'll post more information about this demonstration in the chat. The format for today's webinar is as follows. First, we'll hear from both of our speakers, who will have about 15 minutes each for their remarks. Then the remaining time will be for your questions for the speakers and their answers. Please do keep entering your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. And now we turn to our first speaker, Dr. Alfred Zayas, who is the professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and a former UN independent expert on international order from 2012 to 2018. After the webinar, please check out his extensive series of essays in counterpunch.org. Especially important among these is his statement to the UN Security Council on March 25th of this year on the illegality of unilateral coercive measures, We will post the link to the series of essays and also to that particular statement in the chat. Alfred Zayas is the author of more than 200 scholarly articles and 12 books, including a human rights trilogy available from Clarity Press. These recent 3 books are Building a Just World Order, 2021, Countering Mainstream Narratives, 2022, and The Human Rights Industry, 2023. A link to these will also be posted in the chat. Welcome, Dr. Alfred Zayas. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And dear John, Nan, and Erica, hermanas y hermanos, the weaponization of human rights is Machiavellian and Orwellian at the same time. It means the deliberate instrumentalization of certain purported rights to destroy human dignity itself, to advance political and economic agendas. In a way, it is a modern-day sacrilege because, I mean, you would think the sanctity of human life, the sanctity of the human being, our own common human dignity, well, sorry, that is a matter for thinkers and philosophers, but those who are actually trying to implement human rights have been penetrated. Now, such weaponization of human rights entails a rebellion against the sovereign equality of states, the self-determination of peoples, and the spirituality of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This weaponization is everywhere, at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at the Human Rights Council, at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, at the European Court of Justice, at the European Court of Human Rights, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the International Criminal Court, etc. Weaponization is against the ethos of the international civil servant, in principle. And of course, it violates the object and purpose of the United Nations Charter. But one thing is the theory, another thing is the reality. I was hired back in 1980 by the then director of the Division of Human Rights, Professor Theo van Boven. Those were other times. I served as Secretary of the Human Rights Committee and as Chief of the Petitions Department, that is Registrar. We, in my team and in the Division of Human Rights, we fought against selectivity and double standards. But this is a thing of the past. The rampant politicization of the Office of Human Rights started with the emergence of the unipolar world and the gradual homologation of everything to serve the interest of the United States and the collective West. This is how weaponization works. The US, the EU, NATO identify a geopolitical enemy, targeted, of course, for regime change. Then the target is systematically defamed, demonized, accused of violating human rights, unfortunately, with the complicity of the UN Human Rights Office and its rapporteurs. Fake news, fake history, fake law are disseminated. This means retrogression, not progress. This is retrogression in human rights and in the deontology of the institutions, retrogression in civilization itself. Weaponization of human rights is a frontal attack on ethics. There's no doubt that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has been penetrated. The Human Rights Council, the working groups, the special procedures, the rapporteurs, and the so-called independent experts. I write about this in my book, Building a Just World Order, with my 25 principles of international order, and more succinctly in the human rights industry. 2,000 years ago, the Roman satirist Juvenal posed a crucial question: Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who shall guard over the guardians? Here you have the sixth satire of Juvenalis. What can we do if we discover that the institutions created to protect our rights are in the service of Washington and Brussels and not in the service of humanity? Many do not want to believe this. They are in denial, although the evidence is for anyone to see. This is partly so because money talks. It's the donors that set the agenda. And when the donors are unhappy with the performance of their vassals, they simply cut the money. This is vulgar blackmail, and it has been practiced already for decades by the United States and NATO countries. Now, let me say a word about information war. I devoted a book to the manipulation of public opinion by the media, countering mainstream narratives, published 2022. It's sad to admit it, but civil society has let this happen. When I was a teenager, there was far more freedom of the press, far more freedom of opinion and expression as today. The conglomerates control the news: New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Reuters, AP. And this has expanded to Europe: BBC, Le Monde, El País, El Mundo, the FAZ, the Spiegel, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. There are practically no free newspapers and television networks anywhere, not even in Latin America. Most are homologated and controlled. I was amazed when I was on mission in Venezuela. I wrote my report on Venezuela. That was back in 2018. Most of the press in Caracas was anti-Maduro. And interestingly enough, was not censored. So I would read the newspaper in the morning and I would say, well, I don't see this kind of press or criticism in the United States and elsewhere. In any event, the mainstream media are echo chambers of Washington and Brussels. And journalists who do not play the game are simply fired. See what happened to Tucker Carlson. Happily, he fought back, and he fought back successfully. The Wikipedia is a major source of misinformation, defamation, manipulation, and indoctrination. Now, let me say a few words about civil society organizations. There are excellent non-governmental organizations like the International Peace Bureau, the Geneva International Peace Research Institute, the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities, but all the major NGOs have been hijacked, and many advance the narrative of the hegemon. In many countries, they operate as Trojan horses in connection with the preparation of so-called colored revolutions, coups d'etats, and regime change. It is not so much what some of these NGOs or so-called independent fact-finding commissions write that is objectively wrong, sometimes painfully wrong, but what they refuse to write. That is something that always concerned me. Why don't they write about certain really burning topics? Well, there are good reasons for that. They select their targets, like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and they spare their allies. Of course, there are human rights violations in Nicaragua. Of course, there are violations in Nicaragua. But are they not worse human rights violations in the United States? Who investigates torture in Guantanamo? The CIA secret prisons, endemic discrimination, the genocide and dispossession of the First Nations of the Americas, the indigenous Algonquins and Crees and Cherokees, Iroquois and Mohawks and Sioux. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, Our country, the United States, our country was born in genocide. And he was not talking about slavery. He was not talking about the suffering and the indignities that the Afro-American population endured. He was speaking about the massacred and humiliated indigenous peoples. And the NGOs, if the NGOs and rapporteurs dared to write the truth about Bolivia, Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they would get no more subsidies, certainly not from US aid, from the so-called National Endowment for Democracy, or from Soros's Open Society. Another important issue, the function of US NGOs to destabilize countries, to support the opposition, to whitewash the violence of radical opposition groups. Without NGOs in Kiev, in Ukraine, there would not have been the coup d'etat against the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, back in 2014. Western NGOs were instrumental in the Maidan overthrow, as we know from many honest professors, including John Mersheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, Richard Falk, and others. That is why more and more countries have introduced so-called foreign agent legislation requiring NGOs to reveal the source of their financing, most recently in Georgia, in the Caucasus. But this is not new. Actually, it is the United States that initiated the practice of labeling NGOs foreign agents with their 1938 Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is still very much in force and very much enforced. Allow me a few words about academia. The universities, too, have been hijacked, and the government grants always go to finance government-friendly studies. Think tanks are partisan and unreliable. They are pens for hire. They write what they're ordered to write. Now, a few words on my personal experience as a UN independent expert on international order. I produced 14 reports, about 100 press releases, and information notes. I did this largely without any help from the UN Secretariat, although they are obliged to provide rapporteurs with logistical and substantive support. Yes, they do support the US favored mandates. But mandates like international order, international solidarity, unilateral coercive measures, mercenaries are starved to death. Sometimes the Secretariat even works against our backs and sabotages our work. This has happened to some of my colleagues, and we have written to the High Commissioner and to the President of the Human Rights Council to denounce the situation, as you can well imagine, without any follow-up. Didn't even get a response. My mission to the World Bank and IMF is a case in point. I went to Washington without any United Nations assistance, whatever, whereas other rapporteurs enjoyed 2 and sometimes even 3 assistants on mission. My visit to Venezuela was very nearly stopped by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They claimed there was no money, that the mission was not opportune, that I should let someone else conduct the mission, etc. In preparation, I studied all NGO reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. Fact-checked them, though, when I was in Venezuela, and I was able to talk to the NGOs in Venezuela, to the people in Venezuela, to professors in Venezuela, etc. When my report came out, it was largely ignored, swept under the carpet, because I was not singing the song they wanted me to sing. My only function as rapporteur would have been to investigate and condemn. Just my function would be to condemn Maduro. I mean, to have my own opinion, to dare to actually listen to people and to develop my own judgment, that was not welcomed. When I dared to state the obvious, which I substantiated in the report, that the economic crisis in Venezuela was very largely the result of illegal United States unilateral coercive measures, they refused to discuss the very concrete and pragmatic recommendations that I was formulating. In conclusion, who shall guard over the guardians? Only ourselves. We cannot trust the United Nations, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the NGOs, etc. Yet, what we have to do is to try to reform the system. We must be alert and fight to have a truly free press, to have access to all information, but do not think that we can simply turn our backs on the United Nations. I'm going to say the opposite. I think all the listeners should write to Volker Turk, the current High Commissioner for Human Rights, and say, Mr. High Commissioner, the report that was presented to the Human Rights Council is fundamentally flawed and is biased, should never have been produced. Why don't you yourself come and see with your own eyes? Why don't you come and study the facts and not just rely on so-called independent experts who are not independent? As the case may be, tomorrow, as you already mentioned, Alliance for Global Justice invites to this demonstration on Monday 24th at 4 p.m. in front of the United States mission to the United Nations. I've been there very often in the past. I think what you need is to create alliances in the global South to make sure that the global South, South America, Central America, Africa, and Asia stand up and tell the West that we want a multipolar world and we want multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred de Zayas. That was very stimulating, and I know we're going to have a lot of discussion during the Q&A also.
I'll send you the text.
Oh,
I mean,
good.
I wrote it so as not to go and speak for hours. Yeah.
That will be very good. We can include that then with our follow-up email that we send to all of the registrants. They'll be interested. Thank you.
Will do.
Okay, well, now we turn to our second speaker, John Perry, who is originally from the UK, but has lived in Nicaragua for the last 20 years and serves on the coordinating committee of Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. He writes about Central American geopolitical issues for such publications as The Nation, London Review of Books, Monthly Review, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR. John Perry, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm going to share my screen if I can. I hope that's okay for everybody. Sorry, I'm just, yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, thank you very much, Alfred. As it happens, although we didn't coordinate with each other, my talk, I think, fits nicely into yours, using examples entirely from Nicaragua. And what I want to do is this. I want to talk about the way that NGOs created a consensus narrative in 2018 when the coup attempt took place in Nicaragua, and the way that this continues into the present year. And the task has been to convince the international opinion that the Sandinista government committed crimes against humanity in 2018. The key elements of this were that the protests were peaceful, the government attacked peaceful protesters, 350 people were killed, mostly by the government. Human rights NGOs have been funded to create this narrative, and as Alfred said, only get funding if they succeed in pushing it forward. So every violent event is not examined for its effects on human rights. It's only examined to twist the account to feed the narrative. And the narrative created goes from local NGOs and local media up to international NGOs, the Organization of American States, the UN, and into mainstream media. The mechanism is self-reinforcing and excludes alternative voices like the Solidarity Coalition. And as Alfred said, NGOs become the Trojan horses of the neoliberal system. I circled the character on the right there because he's a demonstrator who's holding a very serious weapon. And the function of NGOs is to deny that that happened, because the protests in 2018 were supposedly peaceful. The official death toll in 2018 was 253, of which only a minority were supporters of the opposition. But this isn't the way it's portrayed by the human rights organizations, who put the figures up as high as 500 or so. And they've never investigated in violence that was perpetrated by the opposition. So they've created a kind of consensus narrative that around 350 deaths occurred, and most or all of these were at the hands of government agents or government supporters. I'm going to look in detail at what some of the human rights NGOs, so-called human rights NGOs in Nicaragua did and continue doing in different forms. These are the three main NGOs that existed in 2018: CPDH, CENID, and ANPDH. All of them set up earlier, some of them with originally with US money, and all of them have received US money since then. In 2017, 2018, at the height of the preparations for the attempted coup, the various organizations received these amounts of money from US aid. And as Alfred said in his book, there are few fields that are as penetrated and corrupted by intelligence services as the human rights NGOs. And that certainly applies in the case of Nicaragua. And this is just funding from US aid. It doesn't look at the funding from the National Endowment for Democracy and other US funded agencies. CEDID itself received $28 million from European institutions in 4 years, and $10 million were for staff salaries. And CEDID, I would guess, never employed more than about 10 or 12 staff. So if we look at ANPDH, they were set up originally in Miami, the instigation of the Reagan administration. They didn't even have an office in Nicaragua until the Sandinistas left power in 1990. Their job was to hide the human rights violations of Reagan's Contra forces. And they're now headed by Alvaro Leiva, who was an integral part of the coup attempt in 2018. And their job, of course, is to hide the human rights violations of the opposition's violent gangs. They were instrumental in ramping up the figures of reported deaths. And here are some examples. By September, they were reporting almost 500 deaths during the coup attempt. And all of these were supposedly government executions of one sort or another. And this was queried, of course, by many people at the time, but it was queried by people from the very same organization a year later. Their senior officer, Gustavo Bermudez, fell out with Leiva, and he started explaining how they made up these figures, including a friend of his who called to say, could he please take his grandmother off the list of people who died because she died of a heart attack, even though she was supposedly a victim of the repression. And they also denounced Leiva for misappropriating the money. This is a slide from the presentation that Bermudez did, denouncing Leiva and saying that he'd stolen nearly $500,000 in payments from US donors. Leiva was instrumental in covering up the violence by the coup plotters in Masaya. He comes from Masaya, which is where I'm speaking from. And he's seen here in July 2018, helping with a local Catholic priest cover up or take away the remains of a dead policeman. This policeman, Gabriel Bardo, was murdered in one of the most horrendous violent attacks in 2018 when he was kidnapped, he was tortured for 24 hours and his body burnt at one of the barricades near Masaya. Labour was also involved in the violence against when the plotters tried to take over, or did take over, the Masaya municipal depot. And this photo shows two friends of mine, Tito and El Chele, who were captured and taken away and tortured. Tito was battered on the head, and El Chele was so badly injured his left arm had to be amputated. And Labour was involved in covering up that violence. Now we turn to CPDH. They supported the leader of the attack on the depot in Masaya in July 2019, who was Christian Fajardo. Fajardo was one of a 5-man junta who on June the 18th declared the city of Masaya independent from the government. And he was responsible for many attacks in Masaya at the time. And the lawyer, Maria Oviedo of CPDH, defended him, but wasn't at all interested in defending his victims. CPDH is another body that was funded by the US. It's a longer established NGO. It changed radically after the revolution in 1979 in Nicaragua and started to accuse the Sandinista government then of extrajudicial executions, but ignored the atrocities of the Contra. And it received funding from the National Endowment for Democracy and from USAID. Human Rights Watch said that public officials repeatedly make stigmatizing statements to undermine the credibility of human rights defenders, speaking about the government's criticisms of CPDH. And if you look at where CPDH and the victims of, or the perpetrators of what happened in Masaya are now, well, Maria Oviedo was this week awarded a prize, a human rights prize in Spain for her valiant defense of human rights in Nicaragua. Christian Fajardo, the leader of the coup attempt in Masaya itself, was released in the government amnesty that occurred in 2019 and now has a delivery business. And Tito and El Chele both resumed work, both are disabled, and they see people like Fajardo in the streets of Masaya every day. Let's turn to another example of a fabricated story. This is the story of Faber Lopez, a police officer who was killed by an opposition sniper in Carazo in the so-called cleanup operation in July 2018. And La Prensa, what was the Nicaragua's newspaper, now based in Costa Rica, has just rerun the story of Faber Lopez, telling the false story that he was killed by fellow police officers, and ignoring the detailed account by his compañera, who explains exactly what was happening to him in the hours before he was killed by a sniper. Incidentally, on the slides, I'm putting some links to these stories if you want to follow them up, and they'll be available afterwards, I think. The Faber Lopez case was picked up by Amnesty International in the report they did in October 2018 called Instilling Terror. And they simply accepted the argument that he'd been killed by his fellow police officers. When Alliance for Global Justice published a report in reply to the Amnesty International report dismissing the truth, which you can find on the AFGJ website, Amnesty ignored the report. They refused to meet to discuss the report, and essentially they just dismissed it. Another tragedy during 2018 that involved a Senate in this occasion. This was the horrendous fire in the Karl Marx barrio in Managua, in which 6 people died, including a baby, in an arson attack on June the 16th. And Gonzalo Carrion from the Senate was there almost immediately that the fire took place and whisked away the survivors of the family and convinced them to blame the attack on the police. And only a year later did they tell the real story and explain that it was very likely opposition criminals who set the fire. And this week, again, La Prensa is reviving the original story, blaming it on the government. These NGOs, these 3 NGOs were all closed down, but they're like a kind of hydra-headed monster because they popped up again. CPDH is now based in Miami, and its head is Pablo Cuevas, who was here in Managua originally. CENID has become the Colectivo de Derechos Humanos Nicaragua Nunca Más in Costa Rica, headed by Gonzalo Carrion, who I've just mentioned. And AMPDH is also based in Costa Rica, still led by Alvaro Leiva. And none of these bodies explain where the money's coming from, but Nunca Más is clearly supported by the National Endowment for Democracy, because here's something from the NED website about them. And I mentioned already that one of these so-called human rights defenders has recently won a prize. Well, all three of the people I've been mentioning have won prizes in this week in Catalonia in Spain. I wanted to mention one other incident, which is the terrorist attack in Morito in July 2018, when a caravan of so-called peaceful protesters entered the town. 200 of them had weapons. They attacked the police station and the town hall. 9 police officers were kidnapped, 4 were killed, and a local teacher was also killed. And next day, the leaders, the organizers of the attack, Medardo Mairena and Pedro Mena, were arrested at the Managua airport as they were trying to leave the country to fly to Los Angeles. And what happened with the human rights organizations? CENID, instead of condemning the attack and investigating what had happened, why people had been killed, instead condemned the government for arresting Medardo Mairena. Amnesty International, the UN Human Rights Council, and many other organizations followed in condemning the action taken against Medardo Mairena. And he was even lionized by the international organization called Frontline Defenders. And you can see on their, I still see on their webpage that he's a hero, a criminal, a human rights hero who's been criminalized by the government, supposedly. Here we are. Medardo Mairena, along with other opposition leaders, spoke at the UN Human Rights Council only in April this year. There he is on the right. And so he was freed in the amnesty of 2019, but he was one of the 222 expelled from the country in February last year. And of course, now he's very active in attacking Nicaragua at international level. And another event that took place this month is that CEGIL, which is an international human rights body, again funded by various different international foundations connected to the US government and others, published a new documentary called Operación Limpieza, cleanup operation, about what the government had to do in June and July 2024, when it had to remove the violent roadblocks that have been set up all over Nicaragua. And it has maps in this documentary showing the operations taking place. And it even includes Morito as if it was part of one of these cleanup operations, whereas all the violence that took place in Morito in that day in July was caused by the opposition. Now we come to the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua. Briefly, the group was formed in 2022. It's published a 300-page, extremely detailed report in 2023, which was a terrible report, terribly biased report. And the Nicaragua Coalition sent a petition signed by human rights experts, including, of course, Alfred, 54 international organizations, and over 300 individuals. And there was no response to the petition that we sent in. We also sent in very detailed critiques of the report. We sent in numerous emails asking to engage them, and only received one-line response referring us to their website. Then a second report came out earlier this year. Again, we sent a petition. Again, Alfred helped us to direct it to the UN Human Rights Council, calling for the report to be withdrawn, and that petition was also ignored. And it's interesting to see the connections between this so-called group of experts and these human rights NGOs. here's Jan Simon, who's the leader of the group of human rights experts, and Angela Buitrago from Chile, who is she from Chile or from Argentina? Chile, I think, who is another member. And they're having an open conversation with people from the US-supported human rights bodies. Yet we were excluded completely from any conversation of this kind. We've never been able to engage with the so-called group of experts. And obviously this so-called Mecanismo para Nicaragua was set up, presumably funded by the US, to enable these people to engage directly with the so-called group of experts. And amongst the things that Jan Simon, the German leader of this group, has said is that he's compared Nicaragua to the Nazi regime. He did it twice in a press conference that he gave in March 2023. And of course, all of this stuff gets repeated internationally. The New York Times then led with a headline, "Nicaragua's Nazis, stunned investigators cite Hitler's Germany." An absolutely gross exaggeration of any human rights issues that occur in Nicaragua, but this is what they're paid to do. And now, of course, Jan Simon, with his latest report, is again calling for new sanctions, new unilateral coercive measures that would directly affect low-income Nicaraguans. In El País, in an interview in El País a few days ago, he called for the International Monetary Fund and the Central American Bank for Economic Integration to block loans to Nicaragua. Of course, these loans, especially those from CABE, are the main source for development projects for low-income communities in Nicaragua. And typically, the El País article was written by Wilfredo Miranda, who used to write for the right-wing opposition outlets in Nicaragua before. So to conclude, I thought I'd put up a statement on this issue by Arundhati Roy from India. She says, NGOs are dangerous. They do what the missionaries used to do in colonial times. They are Trojan horses. The worse the situation, the more the NGOs. And I think Nicaragua, sadly, is a perfect example of that being the case. Thanks.
Thank you, John. And now we'll turn to questions and answers. I see that we have several already posed in the Q&A. Please do keep adding your questions there. Nan will take the first one to pose to speakers.
This is from Barbara Stewart. John Perry, can you possibly give background on why the generally reliable Guardian regularly publishes articles damning Nicaragua? I am so dismayed each time I read their coverage.
Well, that's a good question. Well, I'd like to know the answer myself. As a long-time Guardian reader, when the Guardian correspondent came to Masaya during the coup attempt in 2018, I tried to meet him, but it was impossible to meet him because of the roadblocks. And we were in email correspondence up to the day when he came. And then all of a sudden he emailed me saying, I've been to Masaya, I've seen what's happening, I've seen what the police are doing. And it was apparent that he, like other correspondents, had been the victim of a kind of show by the opposition. They'd created a sniper type situation where shots were fired in the general direction of the protesters. And he'd taken that as evidence that the police were attacking the opposition. At the time, the police were holed up in the police stations. They couldn't go anywhere because the government had told them to stay in the police stations, and the police stations were surrounded by armed protesters, so they couldn't get out. So, you know, I don't know why the Guardian does this, but it seems to have abandoned any attempt, certainly in Latin America, to look fairly at human rights issues. And it's very sad.
Okay. We have a question from Yuri Smouter or Smooter. who says, my question to Dr. Zayas is, what is the state of the anti-war left across Europe? Because isn't the EU heavily involved in imperialism alongside the US and funding NGOs that disseminate propaganda and fake news about Ortega being a dictator?
Hi, Yuri. Delighted to get a question from you. And I still owe you an interview. I will give you an interview in the next couple of months. As the case may be, Yuri, it is, as the Germans say, a Trauerspiel, the situation we're in. The, shall we say, so-called peace-loving left in Europe doesn't exist. I mean, look at the Greens in Germany under Annalena Baerbock. I mean, they are the most warmongering, the most Russophobic and xenophobic in the German spectrum. But the same thing, the so-called left-wingers in France and in England and elsewhere are not true to what, shall we say, the pacifism of the left should be. But now that you raised that, I mean, the prior question on The Guardian, something that I've asked myself, because I have written op-eds for The Guardian, and I find The Guardian betraying international law, betraying human rights. I don't understand what's going on. And I don't know what pressures or what blackmail is happening, but I am dismayed that you cannot rely on The Guardian anymore. And if you want to get your news, you have to go to Yuri Smauter. You have to go to Max Blumenthal. You have to go to the Real News Network and to Amy Goodman and to Aaron Mate, Max Blumenthal, and all of these people, Glenn Greenwald, because the classical, shall we say, left-wing establishment has completely abandoned the, shall we say, the philosophy of peace. If they were interested in peace, they would have prevented the war in Ukraine. I mean, certainly the Minsk agreements were very reasonable, and they provided guarantee of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It was a good compromise that would recognize also the right to self-determination of the Russian majorities in the Donbass and the Russian majorities in Crimea. But the press has done an awful job of muddling the waters so that people keep parroting that, oh, this war by Putin was unprovoked. I cannot think of any war that was more provoked than this one. I mean, NATO has been poking the bear for the last 20 years. I'm not surprised that the bear finally reacted. I'm against the use of force. I'm against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But there are precedents of, shall we say, of NATO committing the crime of aggression in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. So the whole concept of the prohibition of the use of force has been actually destroyed by NATO, not by Putin. And Putin says, if you can do it and get away with it, then I am going to make sure that Ukraine does not pose an existential threat to Russia. And that's why he made his decision in February of 2022. But it must be repeated. The war did not start on 24 February 2022. The war started on the 22nd of February 2014. The war started with the illegal overthrow of the legitimate, democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, which was prepared by these Trojan horses, which was prepared by the NGOs financed by the Soros Foundation, by USAID, by the National Endowment for Democracy. So bringing the situation back to Nicaragua, I know you have an uphill battle ahead of you because the press misinforms systematically. It's not just punctually, systematically. I mean, the mainstream media is against Nicaragua and is not likely to change. I see that my image is faltering. I have no clue why. At least it's faltering what I see. I hope that the audience is not being bothered by that. Thank you.
If it gets too bad, you might temporarily turn off your video, but I hate to see that happen, but that may help with the connection.
Yeah. Well, I can send you a photo and you put a photo. Yeah, it's, I don't know what it is.
Well, we hear you just fine. Nan?
Yes, we really hope for more questions in the question and answer, and also shorter questions. And here's another one for Alfred Zayas. Regarding the use of NGOs to promote disinformation, misinformation, and coups, example being the Ukraine, also Nicaragua. I read on the NED website at one point of the hundreds of NGOs that received NED funding for, quote, human rights and, quote, information media before the 2014 coup in Ukraine. But the NED removed that information from its website. People have trouble concluding U.S. involvement when the evidence is covered up. And what suggestions do you have for people who can't visit a country to find accurate information?
Well, as I said, you cannot rely on Wikipedia. You cannot rely on CNN or on the New York Times. If you want to get your information, I mean, go to the alternative media. There you will get information. If you speak 6 languages, as I do, then you have the benefit that you can listen to Putin in the original. And you can read the treaties that Lavrov put on the table on the 21st of December 2021. Then you can read it in the original Russian. So don't want to be facetious, but the fact is that you have to proactively get the information yourself because these organizations, actually they put false information on their websites and they suppress information. You have this combination of facts that don't fit the narrative are taken out. That reminds me of something that I've encountered at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, information that is sent to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and not only with regard to Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, the information is simply ignored. I know from 2 major Venezuelan non-governmental organizations, Fundalatin and El Grupo Sures, and also from Professor Pascualina Curso, who has written several books on the economic crisis, etc. And they've come to Geneva, to the Human Rights Council. They've spoken with a High Commissioner. I'm talking about Zayed Rader Hussein, They met with the Venezuela desk. They've given the information personally, and none of it ever found its way into the reports. That is, they completely ignore contrary information, not even a footnote. And when I got that information, which I did use in my own report, from Fundalatin and Grupo Surus directly, and I asked them, well, what was the reaction of the High Commissioner? What was the reaction of the Venezuela desk when you brought this material to them? They said they received it, put it aside, and that was it. There was no more interchange with them. That, of course, is a breach of professionalism, of fundamental professionalism that international civil servants have. But even worse than that, you realize that we rapporteurs have a code of conduct. And according to the code of conduct, we are obliged to take that information into account. And that's Article 6 of the Code of Conduct. And when I was in Venezuela, I saw at least 45 NGOs. And I really read and digested all of the information. I mean, I would not have excluded material information just simply because it didn't fit my report. I mean, my report has so many footnotes. I said, I made quite an effort to listen to everybody. And I wish that the independent experts would do as well, that they would actually give Nicaragua a chance, but they don't. I mean, when they got this mandate, it was to condemn Nicaragua, nothing else. And it's not just a question of investigating. It's a question of picking and choosing the facts and the evidences that will support the narrative that you want to put across. So these people are working teleologically. They know what the end report is going to be, and then they find some kind of substantiation for it by working inversely. Instead of building up a case, they have already the conclusion and they work back from it. Thanks.
Barbara?
Okay, yes. First of all, we're getting some comments asking that Dr. Zayas temporarily turn off his video to see if that can make a difference. Sorry to ask you to do that. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here that are related to one another, I think. In fact, 3 of them. One person is asking about something called Zateo, which is Mehdi Hassan's new media outlet. What do you think of that? And another person is asking, and this is of John in particular, but for either one of you, is there a reliable news outlet in Nicaragua that we can access via the internet? And the third question is about John Pilger, who passed away. Any thoughts on his legacy regarding accurate news media and so forth? Okay, so perhaps John could go first and then Alfred.
Well, just to try and deal with the question about reliable news media, the media in Nicaragua or dealing with Nicaragua, because part of the media operates outside the country now, is totally polarized. So on the one hand, you have the opposition media like La Prensa and Confidencial, 100% Noticias, which will never ever say a good word about the government or comment on even the building of a hospital or anything of that kind that's favorable to the government. On the other hand, you have the government-run media like El 19 or government favoring media like Radio La Primerísima, who probably won't criticize the government. They may criticize government agencies sometimes that are, you know, if they've fallen down on the job, but they certainly aren't general news commentators. So that means that the really you have to look at the alternative media that Alfred mentioned. I mean, I try to, when I write, I try to be as objective as possible and put the facts down as I see them, and other people try to do that. I wanted to make a point about the sources of information on NED funding and USAID funding. And it's true that on the websites now, you can find very little about their funding in Nicaragua. And that used to be that didn't used to be the case. In 2017-18, you could find the funding sources for NGOs on those websites, but they started either taking them off completely or saying they were doing certain projects, but not saying who the beneficiaries of the projects were. So really, you have to go to the various leaks of information from those and other US government funded organizations in order to find out what they're paying for in Nicaragua. And I've written about that, Nana's written about that, and there's material on the coalition website. But it's really a case of digging into articles that have appeared in Grey Zone and other places that have exposed some of this funding.
Alfred Zayas, do you have any additional comments?
Well, in the United States, you could invoke the Freedom of Information Act and force NED to disclose more, know whom they're giving their money to and how much. And of course, that costs money. Lawyers are expensive. And the sad thing is that the NGOs that have the money are the ones that are sold out. And the NGOs or individuals who want to have the information frequently do not have the money to ask for freedom of information decision on a particular item. I know that Max Blumenthal has used that avenue, and others in the Real News Network and the alternative scene in the United States do use it. But of course, it would be far better if the NED would come forward with the information. They have an interest in hiding it. And as everybody knows, I mean, the NED does overtly what the CIA does covertly. I mean, the NED is there basically to destabilize targeted countries. And that is very evident. Great scholars have written about it, including Jeffrey Sachs and John Mersheimer. And unfortunately, these professors are not the advisors of Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken. And it's really a tough battle to see how you actually get the information. Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees the right to access all information. It's the right to receive and impart all information. And that, of course, is violated by the United States on a daily basis. The United States does report to the Human Rights Committee, secretary of which I used to be, and the United States will give you a blah, blah. And unfortunately, the Human Rights Committee is not what it once was. And not only is the, shall we say, the intellectual acuity of the members lower than it was in its early days, but also the independence of the members of the Human Rights Committee is not what it used to be. So I have limited expectation from any attempt to get help from the Human Rights Committee. Now, to the extent that those who are listening to me now have contact to journalists whom they know and they respect, I mean, it is in your own interest to make sure that this information goes out, and not to do publicity for myself, but when I wrote The Human Rights Industry, I really wanted to alert the general public. I mean, I'm not addressing that book just to the High Commissioner for Human Rights and to the Human Rights Council. I am addressing all people who are concerned about the development of human rights and the retrogression that we are witnessing in the human rights field. I make very concrete and pragmatic recommendations. I wish that the book were reviewed. It has not been reviewed in the American Journal of International Law. It has not been reviewed in the Cambridge Law Journal, in where my prior books used to be reviewed all the time. And I mean, the situation in academia has declined so much over the past decades that the American Journal of International Law, basically, you might want to call it the American Journal of Imperial Law. It basically supports the narrative of the State Department and the Pentagon. So if you have a different narrative, your book is not going to be reviewed. I mean, it's that's one kind of censorship. In the academic circles, you would think that a book written by a former secretary of the Human Rights Committee, former registrar, former rapporteur, would necessarily be reviewed in the New York Times. Far from it. I mean, when I was a rapporteur, I wrote op-eds for the New York Times regularly. I was not able to place a single one, let alone they asking me for an article, or they wanting to hear my opinion on some issue. So that is the, shall we say, fundamental problem that the mainstream media, whether it be television or press, is really controlled. And they are echo chambers for the Pentagon and for the State Department. And they're not interested in giving me or John Perry any kind of a platform. Thanks.
One final follow-up. Did either of you, I don't think you did, answer about Mehdi Hassan? Any information or opinion about that?
Well, Mehdi Hassan's work on Palestine certainly is very interesting, but I haven't seen that he's done anything on Latin America. And, you know, understandably, Palestine is going to be a priority, but it would be very interesting if he and others turn their attention to Latin America. There's plenty going on here for him to look at.
Nan?
Yes. Go ahead, Alfred.
Yeah, if I may, because fear that I've been a bit too pessimistic. There are possibilities. Unilateral coercive measures, about which I spoke in the Security Council on the 25th of March, without a doubt, are illegal. The General Assembly adopts every year for the last 20 years or so, a resolution condemning them as contrary to the United Nations Charter, contrary to freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce, sovereign equality of states, right of self-determination of peoples, etc., etc. Actually, in the case of Nicaragua, crass violation of Article 19 and 20 of the Charter of the Organization of American States, which specifically prohibits any kind of force, pressure brought upon states to force them to change their political or economic system. Now, having said that, unilateral coercive measures are illegal. The next step is to recognize that unilateral coercive measures kill. Not only do they kill in the tens of thousands. Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot published a study back in 2019 with the estimate that the unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela had already caused 40,000 deaths. Primarily because if you are diabetic and you don't get your insulin, you die. If you need your retroviral drugs for HIV, you don't get it, you die. As the case may be, there's an estimate for 1 year alone, 2018, 40,000. I multiply that for the years before and after, and for the really awful lack of medicines in Venezuela as a direct result of the United States UCMs. Now, think Article 7 of the Statute of Rome prohibits crimes against humanity. When you kill people, as UCMs kill people, that constitutes a crime against humanity under Article 7. Now, my friend Professor Bill Shabas presented a case to the International Criminal Court, and it was received, it was registered, it's called Venezuela 2, and it's an investigation into, are these sanctions against Venezuela a crime against humanity? The current prosecutor has put it on the back burners, doing nothing with it. Hasn't been officially withdrawn or officially dismissed, but are not doing anything about it. They're moving forward with an investigation of whether Venezuela, meaning Maduro, has committed crimes against humanity against the opposition. It's absurd. And that's what I'm telling you. I mean, the ICC has no credibility. I mean, the ICC is in the service of the collective West and is there only to target the geopolitical enemies of the collective West. And they don't want to condemn the United States for unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela, or for that matter, against Nicaragua. But nothing stops a consortium of lawyers in Nicaragua to submit a case to the International Criminal Court saying we are suffering unilateral coercive measures as a result of unilateral coercive measures, this and that and that and that and that and that has happened. Here we quantify the damage, and we want that to be investigated under the Statute of Rome. I myself, together with colleagues of the Geneva International Peace Research Institute, I'm one of the directors of the GPRI. We presented a court case on the 25th of May to the International Criminal Court, to Karim Khan, on another issue, on Gaza, on the genocide issue in Gaza. And this time we presented a case against Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission for complicity in the genocide. It's very well argued, the 29-page legal brief. As I say, I don't expect Karim Khan to move forward with this investigation. But we have had a certain amount of impact in the press, and we published it in Counterpunch also. I'll send you the link. I'll send you the, we had four articles on it in Counterpunch with regard to the issue of complicity in genocide. I mean, who is complicit in genocide? Of course, Germany, of course, France. I mean, anyone who is delivering weapons to Israel is complicit in the genocide. But also those officials of the European Commission that have given military, political, diplomatic, economic, propagandistic support to the genocide being conducted by Israel against the Palestinians. So, as I say, this is an information war, and it is crucial that things like this be discussed. I mean, once the cat is out of the bag, I mean, you can't put it back into the bag. I mean, it's now known, and it's been in quite a few newspapers, that there is a legal brief against Ursula von der Leyen personally for complicity in her function as president of the European Commission in giving support, military, political, economic support to Israel. So it's a question of perception. If you get people to start thinking differently, if you get people to start thinking that war crimes are not only committed by, shall we say, by Russia and countries that you don't like. I mean, war crimes are committed by your allies. I mean, this realization has to simply click. People must finally understand that our leaders are complicit in genocide. And that can only be done through a process of discussion, publication, conferences, things like this, webinars in which people are informed. And my books, my human rights trilogy, deal with these issues, but obviously the mainstream media have decided that the books do not exist. So even though I'm selling not badly, but it's not a question of how many books I've actually sold. What is important is how many people have actually reflected on it, or how many people are willing to act on it. Thanks.
Great. Nan?
Yes, this question is for John. Would you agree that currently a primary focus of U.S. aggression against Nicaragua is to debilitate the economy and thus coerce the people of Nicaragua using sanctions, pressure on international financial institutions, brain drain to the U.S. via U.S. immigration policy, U.S. travel warnings on travel to Nicaragua, and then if you could answer briefly the following question, what has Nicaragua done to be in solidarity with Gaza?
Well, yes, on the first one, certainly I agree with the question. There's no doubt that the US government effectively encourages Nicaraguans to emigrate, and they select the better Nicaraguans, the more active, more entrepreneurial Nicaraguans through the so-called humanitarian parole arrangement. And the numbers aren't enormous yet, but you know, Nicaragua is only a small country, 7 million people. So losing tens of thousands of active people who are potential business runners is damaging indeed. And I think that there's an issue here for the US. I mean, Nicaragua isn't suffering to anything like the same extent as Cuba and Venezuela, obviously, yet. And I guess that the US is held back a little bit here because Nicaraguan emigration is relatively low compared with the three northern countries in Central America, the Northern Triangle. And if illegal Nicaraguan emigration grew rapidly, that would be an issue in the US. And of course, the more that the US puts pressure on Nicaragua, the more it drives it into making better relations with China and with Russia. And it's exactly what it has been doing. And both countries are helping considerably in development here. Let me just say, in answer to your second question now, yes, there's been a tremendous interest on the part of the Nicaraguan government and the Sandinista party and Nicaraguans in general in what's going on in Gaza and the terrible events there. Nicaragua was the first country to join in with South Africa in the International Court of Justice case. And of course, it brought its own case against Germany, which was portrayed in the international media as a failure and even used as a sort of form of anti-propaganda against Nicaragua. But yet it was relatively successful. Germany had to restrict its arms sales to Israel. And Nicaragua is saying that it does at least show that arms companies and countries like Germany have to be aware that they might be taken before international courts if they persist in assisting the genocide that's taking place in Gaza.
Thank you. Barbara?
Okay, there are two questions here that I think are related. Perhaps this should be the last question, given that our time is growing short. So I'm going to try to combine these into one. The main question is, why is the US aggressing so much against Nicaragua? Here's how it's phrased according to David Brookbank. Would you agree that currently a primary focus is to debilitate the economy of Nicaragua and thus coerce the people of Nicaragua using sanctions, pressure on international financial institutions, etc.? And then Barbara Stewart asks, she says, deplorable US sanctions on Nicaragua keep increasing. What does the US expect to achieve? What could they possibly what do they supposedly stand to gain? John first.
Well, I think that the US simply wants to get rid of the Sandinista government, and it wants a neoliberal government. And the opposition, insofar as they offer anything, offer a neoliberalism. I mean, the opposition leaders are in favor of what happened in Peru when President Castillo was deposed. They're in favor of what happened in Bolivia when Evo Morales was deposed, and they're in favor of what's happening in Argentina with the kind of policies being pursued by Milei. And the US would be very happy with that kind of government. Fortunately, it's not going to happen, I don't think. Nicaraguans have had 16 years experience of neoliberalism from 1990 to 2006. They're very well aware of the effects of neoliberalism in adjoining countries. For example, until recently, Honduras was the most violent country in Latin America, and is still, the government there, Xiomara Castro's government, is struggling with the problems caused by years of neoliberalism. So I don't think the US will succeed, but what it clearly wants to do is to get rid of the Sandinista government and get rid of as many Sandinistas as possible in the process.
Okay, Alfred, do you have any additional?
Yes,
comment?
very quickly. The United States imposed unilateral coercive measures on Cuba since 1961. Now, it's been 63 years of draconian United States blockade, which, by the way, has been condemned by the General Assembly 31 times. And the United States has been ordered to lift the embargo, et cetera, to no avail. But why do I mention that? You have here 63 years of so-called sanctions that have not resulted in what the United States wanted, regime change. We have now an economic war against Venezuela since 1999, including the coup d'etat of April 2002, organized, financed by the United States, et cetera. It failed. It only lasted 47 hours. There again, the purpose of the unilateral coercive measures is to bring the government down, but it's not doing it. Has not been successful in regime change. It's been successful in killing people. It's been successful in making the lives of Cubans and the lives of Venezuelans miserable with scarcity of medicine, scarcity of food items, et cetera. So it's sheer cruelty. And one semantic point that I wanted to make. Please don't use the term sanctions. The United States has no moral or legal authority to impose sanctions on anybody. The United States has no moral or legal right to punish anybody. The only legal sanctions are those imposed by the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter. And even those can be very destructive. Certainly the UN sanctions regime against Iraq were criminal and cost 1 million human lives. And of course, those were not really United Nations sanctions. They were forced by the United States on the United Nations at a time when Russia didn't count. These sanctions date back to 1991, and the viciousness of these sanctions under Bill Clinton are just horrendous. And you may recall the famous question directed to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright when UNICEF had come out with a figure, 500,000 kids have died because of the UN sanctions. Do you want to maintain the sanctions? Do you think the sanctions are justified? And then you can see it on YouTube. You see Madeleine Albright hesitate for a moment. And then she says, with a straight face, she says, yes, I think they were justified. So, I mean, she's saying that killing 500,000 kids was justified in order to get regime change in Iraq. Absolutely extraordinary. So back to the sanctions against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Nicaragua. They affect the most vulnerable. Those are the ones who suffer the unilateral coercive measures. And that's why they're so particularly criminal. And the United States has the experience of failure. They want to get regime change in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They haven't gotten it. And sanctions is not the way to go. And sanctions, as I said, are condemned every single year by the General Assembly, usually by a vote of 133 to 40 against, and the rest are abstentions. And the same thing in the Human Rights Council. Every year there's a resolution condemning unilateral coercive measures. And the United States doesn't care. The United States, European Union don't care because they think that they're above international law. And that is part of the problem. Exceptionalism, this horrible word, exceptionalism. The United States claims to be above international law, does not want to subordinate itself to the United Nations Charter. And what is happening is that the world order is coming apart. The world order is coming apart because the United States and the European countries are complicit in such enormous criminality and in such enormous outlawry. I mean, imagine, stealing the Citgo, stealing the Venezuelan gold in the Bank of England, now wanting to steal Russia's sovereign reserves, 300 billion, etc. I mean, they're destroying themselves what civilization established over centuries. I mean, the damage that the United States and United Kingdom and France and Germany have done to international law is colossal. And it's going to take a long time to, shall we say, repair the damage. And the only way I can see the damage being repaired is with a new multipolar, multilateral world order. And, shall we say, a rejection of the arrogance of the United States and of the collective West, that they can dictate international law to the rest of the world. The Chinese, the Indians, the South Africans, the Brazilians, the Mexicans are telling the United States no. And I think that the no is going to be a lot louder in the coming months and coming years, because essentially I sense that the global majority has had it with the United States and with the West. And it's important for Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela to hold fast and to not bend under this kind of pressure. And again, anybody who is in New York tomorrow, please go to the United States mission on First Avenue and demonstrate. I wish you luck.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers and to everyone who attended, and to Nan and Erica for a very successful webinar, I think. And so it's drawn to a close now. I see some people have already dropped off, but thank you everyone for attending. Since apparently you have been unable to save the chat, I think it could be fair that if we see that you attended, oh good, you're back, and you're not blinking or anything, your video looks great. You look great.
It's
oh
starting.
no. Well, anyway, I think it's fair that for anyone that we can see attended this webinar, that we will share the chat with you. I don't think we should share it with registrants who did not attend, because that would be a violation. Yes, that too. And several other pieces of information and links. So Nan, I don't know if you had any final comments, but I just
No,
want to say
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot, and goodbye for now. We'll be sharing lots of things in coming days.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye.